Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal. After Willow shattered the wedding ceremony just moments before exchanging vows, the church plunged into a cold and suffocating silence. The weight of stunned disbelief fell over everyone like a heavy shroud, anchoring them in place as if time itself had halted. All eyes turned toward Drew, who stood frozen at the altar, his expression drained of color, his mouth slightly open, incapable of forming any coherent thought as the love of his life walked away without a backward glance. Willow's wedding gown trailed behind her like a ghost of what could have been, a shredded symbol of a dream disintegrating before it could ever take form. Her heels echoed sharply on the stone floor as she made her way toward the exit, leaving behind nothing but mascara-streaked cheeks and a trail of heartbreak. Nina stood motionless at the threshold of the chapel, her hands clenched around the small silver clutch she hadn't opened all evening. Her heart was heavy, twisted between anguish and quiet relief. To witness her daughter, radiant in white, abandon the man she was about to marry should have broken something fundamental within her. But it didn't. Instead, beneath the bruised ache of being disowned by Willow, a dark satisfaction began to bloom. Drew had lost her. Not temporarily. Not in some game he could later win with words or strategy. He had lost Willow forever. And in Nina's mind, that was how it needed to be. She had seen behind Drew's polished exterior, beneath the charm and calculated gestures, into the hollowness of a man who could manipulate affection and children alike to secure his own interests. He had preyed on Willow's vulnerability, promising her a future built on trust while silently chipping away at her independence. Nina had tried to warn Willow, gently at first, then with more urgency, but her daughter had pushed her away. Even so, seeing Willow reject Drew at the final moment vindicated every sleepless night, every difficult confrontation. Willow was free. And that was enough, for now. In the days that followed, Drew Kane descended into a spiral so dark that it stunned even his most loyal allies. The mask he had worn for years, the carefully curated persona of the level-headed protector and honorable man, cracked beyond repair. With Willow gone, something inside Drew unraveled. He roamed Port Charles with a permanent storm behind his eyes, a man consumed by a single obsessive thought: someone had turned Willow against him. Someone had poisoned her with the truth. And now, they had to pay. His suspicion darted from face to face, never resting for long. Nina, of course, was the first and most obvious target in his mind. He was certain she had revealed something, twisted Willow's thoughts against him. But she wasn't alone in his list of traitors. Curtis. Portia. Michael. Anyone who had been near Willow in the days leading up to the ceremony became a suspect. The paranoia metastasized quickly, warping into a fury that no one could temper. He attempted to see Scout at Alexis's house but was blocked at the door. He turned up at Carly's unannounced, pounding on her door until Jason appeared in the shadows and warned him away. Whispers followed Drew wherever he went, about the incident at the church, about the things he screamed in the Metro Court lobby, about the erratic tone in his voice as he accused Nina of drugging him and warned everyone that they were part of a coordinated effort to ruin his life. No one knew what to believe anymore. Was Drew lashing out in grief, or was this the true man unmasked at last? Nina watched it all unfold with a growing sense of dread. She had known Drew would react badly to the collapse of the wedding, but this was far more dangerous than she had anticipated. The man had become unpredictable, volatile. And worse, he was capable of violence. Nina realized with chilling clarity that Drew was no longer capable of restraint. If allowed to continue on this path, he could do real harm. Not just to Willow, but to everyone Nina cared about. She began gathering evidence, not to report him to the authorities just yet, but to understand the extent of his unraveling. At the Metro Court, she watched as he berated a bartender for getting his order wrong. She overheard him make veiled threats to Curtis during a tense confrontation in the park. She obtained security footage of him cornering Portia in the hospital parking lot, his body language aggressive, unhinged. Her gut screamed that it was only a matter of time before he snapped. That time came when Drew tried to break into Carly's home one night, under the delusion that Willow had been hidden away inside. He thought if he could just speak to her, everything would make sense again. That he could reclaim what he believed had been unjustly taken. But Willow wasn't there. And Carly wasn't alone. Nina had been trailing Drew all evening. She knew he was headed for something reckless, something irreversible. As he crept toward the door, her breath caught in her chest. She had given him every chance to stop, to come to his senses. But he had ignored them all. This was no longer about one failed romance or a broken heart. Drew had become a ticking bomb. And the blast radius would reach every person she loved. In that crucial moment, with the porch bathed in the soft glow of a single overhead light and Drew's shadow stretching along the floor, Nina stepped from the darkness behind him. Her eyes were no longer soft. They held resolve, icy, absolute. The sound that followed was sharp and final, a clean, heavy thud that echoed down the quiet street. Drew collapsed forward against the doorframe, unconscious, stripped of his last remaining illusion of control. When he woke, everything was gone. His phone had been disabled. His access to his accounts frozen. His reputation obliterated by a slow leak of videos and testimony that painted him as a threat, not a victim. He had no idea how it happened, only that the world had turned on him overnight. What he didn't realize was that Nina had orchestrated it all with meticulous precision. Every move he made had become another nail in the coffin she built around him. It wasn't revenge. It was protection. And now, as Willow tried to piece together her life again, visiting Carly to beg for time with her children, she had no idea of the lengths her mother had gone to preserve her freedom. Nina didn't ask for thanks. She didn't expect forgiveness. She stood alone most nights, gazing out her window, wondering if the price she paid in isolation was worth the peace she'd carved out for Willow. But deep inside, she knew one thing with certainty: Drew would never again threaten her daughter's peace. Not with words. Not with schemes. Not with shadows. She had ended him before he could begin again. And whatever came next, Nina was ready to face it, even if she had to face it alone. Drew didn't die, but the man who woke up in a sterile, unfamiliar room wasn't the same person who once commanded power, prestige, and admiration across Port Charles. He regained consciousness slowly, his head pounding, his memory fragmented, the world around him stripped of everything he had built. The room was quiet, too quiet, with no familiar faces to greet him, no messages of concern, no legal team waiting to explain the damage control underway. He was utterly alone, confined to a private facility under a false name, his identity erased with the same ruthless efficiency he had once used to rise through the ranks. His reputation, assets, and social capital had all been systematically dismantled. It hadn't been a chaotic collapse. It had been surgical, precise, methodical. Nina had orchestrated it all, her quiet fury turning into a relentless operation of retribution masked as protection. While Drew lay unconscious, she had already begun contacting the media through intermediaries, feeding them carefully fabricated evidence, edited videos, misinterpreted audio clips, twisted statements from anonymous sources, that painted Drew as violent, unstable, and dangerous. By the time he opened his eyes again, the damage had already metastasized. Port Charles media outlets ran back-to-back stories on Drew's hidden behavior. Headlines screamed about threatening text messages, abusive encounters at the Metro Court, and false accusations against well-respected citizens like Curtis, Portia, and even Alexis. The public turned quickly. Sponsors severed ties. Contracts were voided. The board of directors at his business ventures held emergency meetings, then quietly announced his removal. The community that once cheered his return from captivity now looked at him with suspicion and contempt. And the most damning blow came not from the media or the investors, but from Willow herself. Nina had made sure Willow saw everything. Every damning image. Every accusation, true or not. She didn't tell Willow to hate him. She simply allowed her to see him through a different lens, a man whose facade had crumbled. And though Willow said nothing publicly, her silence was deafening. She didn't visit. She didn't call. She didn't ask Carly or Michael about him. It was as though she had buried him already, this time not out of anger but because there was simply nothing left to resurrect. Michael, too, took a stand, not out of revenge, but out of protection. When Willow expressed a desire to visit Wiley and Amelia, Michael hesitated. Not because he doubted her love, but because he feared her wounds were still too fresh, her judgment clouded by trauma. He remembered the way she had collapsed outside Carly's house, still in her wedding dress, her voice trembling as she pleaded to see her children. He saw in her eyes the haunting residue of emotional abuse, the confusion of betrayal, and he knew it wasn't time yet. For her sake and theirs, he kept the children close. Willow didn't fight him. She understood. It hurt, but she understood. Meanwhile, Christina was navigating her own personal storm. Her confession to Michael about paying Cody to seduce Ava and the near-fatal break tampering weighed heavily on her conscience. Every smile felt false, every conversation a reminder of how far she'd fallen in pursuit of revenge. She tried to atone, volunteering, keeping distance from the chaos, even attempting to reconnect with Alexis, but the shadow of what she had done refused to lift. She lived in constant fear that Rick or Ava would go public, that the fragile threads holding her world together would snap under pressure. Molly, still unsettled from the fallout, found herself pulling away from Cody. Their chemistry now seemed suspicious, her trust in others corroded by too many half-truths. Cody, for his part, felt adrift, unwelcome in both Christina's and Molly's orbit. Jocelyn, too, began sensing that the air in Port Charles was growing thick with secrets and tension. People whispered in corners, eyes darted nervously in cafes, and a creeping anxiety settled over the town like fog that refused to lift. Trust had become brittle. Loyalties fragile. Relationships felt like thin strands of wire, ready to snap in a single jolt of emotional static. In the midst of it all, Jason watched. He remained silent as chaos bloomed around him, a shadow amid unraveling lives. He wasn't just observing. He was calculating, sensing the balance of power shifting in dangerous ways. When he approached Liesel, it wasn't just to mourn Britt. It was to prepare. His questions about Britt's burial were more than nostalgic, they were urgent. Something inside him stirred, a primal instinct that told him the past wasn't done with them. Liesel, haunted in her own right, gave him little to work with, but the fear in her eyes was enough. Thousands of miles away, in a concealed laboratory in Croatia, Britt Westbourne, who had not died as the world believed, was working under a false identity. Her mind had been fractured and rebuilt after surviving a covert medical experiment that never received closure. As she ran diagnostics on a data stream, anomalies began to appear, irregular frequencies, disrupted coordinates, interference in satellite relays. These weren't mechanical failures. Someone was watching her, tracking her every move. And there was only one person with the access and obsession to do that, Jack Brennan. Britt began to suspect that the program they both once worked on, an experimental initiative hidden beneath layers of WSB denial, had been reactivated. Something that was supposed to be buried along with the lives it destroyed had been unearthed. She couldn't yet determine what it meant, but the disruptions in the surveillance grid aligned with new movements in Port Charles. Movements too synchronized to be coincidence. The walls were closing in from every direction. Nina had won her war, but she knew the peace would be temporary. Drew may have been neutralized, but ghosts didn't stay buried long in Port Charles. Not when old enemies resurfaced in new skin. Not when lies and secrets had generational roots. The fragile illusion of order was splintering, and even those who thought themselves safest, Michael, Jason, Liesel, Willow, were standing closer to the edge than they realized. And deep in the shadows, where discarded truths rotted and long-forgotten names whispered through surveillance networks, the real threat was beginning to stir. Though no one dared speak it aloud, the atmosphere in Port Charles carried an unshakable truth. Drew's downfall was not the end, it was only the beginning of something far more volatile. His collapse had triggered a chain reaction, setting into motion a series of emotional ruptures and psychological unravelings that stretched far beyond the confines of his own ruined legacy. Like the first tremor before a larger quake, Drew's destruction cracked the thin veneer of normalcy the town clung to, exposing nerves that had long been frayed, loyalties that were no longer secure, and secrets that refused to stay buried. Nina had won a battle, yes. But the victory came at a cost she had yet to fully comprehend. What she accomplished wasn't a final resolution, it was a detonation that would send aftershocks rippling through every relationship, every alliance, every memory that still lingered in the foggy corners of Port Charles. She had stepped into a minefield of quiet vendettas, where old enemies waited like wolves, licking their wounds and biding their time. She had painted herself into the center of a storm that hadn't even fully formed, and now the winds were beginning to shift. Curtis, ever perceptive, couldn't ignore the silence that followed Nina wherever she went. It wasn't the silence of peace, it was the unnerving hush of something being withheld, of pieces missing from a larger puzzle. He didn't voice his suspicions, but they gnawed at him in private moments. He had seen too much, heard too little, and trusted too many for too long. The way Nina moved now, with calculated grace and eyes that never quite settled on one place for too long, raised more questions than answers. Portia, meanwhile, felt the weight of something heavy in the air. She couldn't explain why, but ever since the wedding imploded and Willow disappeared into grief and silence, Portia found herself plagued by nightmares. Dreams where Willow stood alone in the center of a ruined church, the aisle strewn with shattered glass and petals soaked in blood. Dreams where Drew whispered things no one could hear, and Nina watched from the shadows with an expression that blurred the line between protectiveness and menace. These weren't just dreams, they were warnings etched in her subconscious, screaming that the chaos wasn't over. Carly, who had once believed she knew Drew better than anyone, was beginning to question her own judgment. She remembered the man who had returned from captivity with scars and a smile, who had convinced her he was grounded and trustworthy. But now, standing on the sidelines and watching as the ruins of his life scattered like ash, she wondered if she had ever truly known him at all. More disturbingly, she began to sense that whatever was happening wasn't just about Drew, it was about all of them. Something ancient, invisible, was wrapping around them like a noose, and Carly feared she too had been marked as a player in a game she didn't even know she was playing. And so, the nights grew longer in Port Charles. The city, with its glittering facade and its quiet alleys full of whispers, held its breath. Old scores were being tallied in private, while the illusion of order frayed at the edges. And there, standing alone in her penthouse window, Nina stared out at the dim glow of the city like a sentinel waiting for the next wave. Her reflection looked back at her in the glass, not triumphant, not relieved, but hollowed by the weight of choices she could never undo. Willow had yet to forgive her. The silence between mother and daughter was a living thing, pulsing with guilt and grief. Drew was still alive, somewhere, perhaps broken, perhaps still dangerous. And every day that passed without resolution only added to the uncertainty that hung over them all. Nina didn't believe for a second that Drew was done. He was wounded, yes, but sometimes wounded animals were the most dangerous of all. He had nothing left to lose, and that made him unpredictable, capable of anything. And beyond Drew, there were darker truths, older stories clawing their way to the surface. Secrets buried deep beneath the foundation of Port Charles. Secrets about alliances forged in desperation, experiments forgotten by the world but not by those they affected, manipulations passed down like legacies. These were the things no one spoke of, the things people like Brennan and Liesel understood all too well. The kind of truths that waited patiently beneath the surface until the right moment to strike. Yet despite all of it, the fear, the distance, the disconnection, Nina clung to a single conviction. She had saved her daughter. Maybe not in the way that inspired gratitude, or even understanding, but in a way that mattered. She had pulled Willow back from the brink, had destroyed the man who would have kept her in emotional captivity, had severed a future that would have drained the light from Willow's eyes over time. Nina knew she could not undo the pain she caused. She could not rewrite history. But she could own the future. The price of that future, however, was steep. It was loneliness, mistrust, and the knowledge that redemption might never come. It was knowing that every step she took from now on would be shadowed by the ghost of Drew Kane, his voice echoing in corners, his presence lingering like smoke. But Nina accepted it. She would walk alone if she had to. She would carry the burden of her choices. Because in the end, she had done what no one else dared to do. She had looked into the face of the monster and struck first. She had torn off the mask and laid bare the rot beneath. She had saved her daughter from a nightmare disguised as a promise. And if the cost of that salvation was to forever live with the memory of what she'd done, then so be it. For tonight, at least, Willow was safe. And for Nina, that was enough. And so, under the quiet hum of street lamps and the veil of a city pretending nothing had changed, Port Charles entered a new phase, one stitched together not by peace, but by silence and fear. The fall of Drew Kane had cracked open the thin crust of illusion that had long held this town together. What was once a bustling community of families, allies, and enemies reluctantly coexisting had become a fragile ecosystem hanging on by whispers and unspoken truths. Trust was no longer a currency but a relic, and every conversation, every glance carried with it the weight of suspicion. Nina remained a solitary figure at the center of it all, the woman who did what needed to be done when no one else would.